The Blackwater churned red beneath a hunter's moon as iron chains sank into depths that had swallowed secrets since before Georgia claimed this land. Somewhere in the tangled vastness of the Okefenokee wetlands, a man's screams dissolved into the night chorus of bullfrogs and cicadas, while prehistoric jaws closed around justice too long delayed. The date was June 21st, 1852, Midsummer Night, and in those primordial waters where cypress knees rose like gravestones, an enslaved man named Thomas was about to transform his overseer into a feast for creatures older than human cruelty itself. This is the story of how America's most savage system bred its own reckoning, one calculated bite at a time. What happened in those midnight hours would never appear in any courthouse record. Yet, every soul on the Blackwood Estate knew the truth. Some debts can only be settled in blood and brackish water, witnessed by nothing but indifferent stars and patient, ancient hunger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The tupelo trees stood sentinel over water black as gunpowder, their gnarled roots creating a labyrinth where moonlight died before touching the surface. Spanish moss hung from twisted branches like the hair of drowned women, swaying in the humid Georgia breeze that carried the scent of decay and wild jasmine in equal measure. This was the Okefenokee's western edge, where the Blackwood Estate's cultivated fields surrendered to primordial wilderness that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires built on human suffering. The year was 1852, and America's peculiar institution had reached its zenith of efficiency and brutality. Cotton was king, and kings demanded tribute paid in broken backs and separated families. The Blackwood Estate sprawled across 500 acres of prime Georgia bottomland, where Sea Island cotton grew tall as a man's chest and white as bleached bone. 300 souls labored under the crack of overseers, whips, their lives measured in pounds picked, and punishments endured. But tonight, in the fetid darkness where alligators bellowed territorial claims that echoed like artillery fire, a man named Thomas was about to balance scales that had tipped toward injustice for 37 years. His hands, calloused from decades of cotton picking, coiled rope with the precision of a hangman preparing a noose. The bait secured in his leather satchel wasn't for fishing. The fury burning in his chest had been stoked by 1,000 small cruelties until it blazed hot enough to consume everything in its path. Overseer Silas Blackwood, nephew to the estate's master and architect of innovations in human suffering, would never see dawn break over the cotton fields he patrolled with such zealous cruelty. Some men are born to violence, others have it thrust upon them until they become its perfect instrument. Thomas had spent 37 years learning the difference. The Blackwood Estate sat 12 miles inland from Savannah's bustling port, connected to civilization by a crushed oyster shell road that turned to soup when the rains came. Master Edmund Blackwood had inherited the property from his father in 1831, expanding operations with the ruthless efficiency of a man who saw human beings as interchangeable components in a profit-generating machine. The main house rose 3 stories above manicured gardens, its Greek Revival column supporting a facade of gentility that crumbled under scrutiny. Behind those whitewashed walls, ledgers documented the buying and selling of human flesh, with the same clinical precision used for recording livestock transactions. In the basement, punishment tools hung on pegs like kitchen implements, each designed for specific applications of pain. The whipping post in the yard bore stains that no amount of lye soap could bleach away, dark streaks that testified to Silas Blackwood's creative approach to discipline. Silas had arrived at the estate 3 years prior, fresh from agricultural school in Charleston, where he'd studied the latest methods in labor management and crop rotation. But his real education had come from examining plantation records across the South, identifying best practices in maintaining productivity through calculated terror. He believed that enslaved workers required constant reinforcement of their station through physical correction, public humiliation, and the systematic destruction of family bonds. His innovations included the punishment swamp, a section of wetland behind the estate, where infractions too severe for simple whipping received more creative attention. Workers who attempted escape found themselves spending nights waist-deep in black water, secured to cypress trees while mosquitoes feasted and cottonmouths hunted. Those who survived the experience rarely tried running again. Those who didn't survive became cautionary tales, whispered in the quarters after dark. Thomas had endured 37 years in bondage across 3 different estates, sold twice when economic downturns forced his previous owners to liquidate assets. Born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, he'd been separated from his mother at age 8 when a traveling trader offered cash that his master couldn't refuse. The memory of her screaming his name as the wagon pulled away remained fresh as yesterday's wound, a constant ache that no amount of time could heal. He'd survived the Middle Passage's land-based equivalent, chained in a coffle that marched south through the Carolinas, watching weaker members collapse and die on roads that disappeared behind them like burned bridges. Master Blackwood had purchased him at the Savannah market in 1847, attracted by his knowledge of waterways and proven skill at tracking runaways through terrain that swallowed white men whole. The irony was exquisite and deliberate. The Blackwood family had bought the instrument of their own destruction, then sharpened it through years of systematic cruelty until it could cut with surgical precision. On the morning of June 20, 1852, Thomas stood in the pre-dawn darkness of the quarters, supposedly preparing for another day of tracking 2 runaways who'd fled into the swamp 3 nights prior. But the coiled rope around his shoulder served different purposes than the master imagined. The raw chicken secured in his satchel wasn't trail rations, and the cold calculation burning behind his eyes had been refined through decades of swallowed rage and buried grief. Where are you experiencing this story right now? What shadows fill your own corner of the world as you read these words? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if tales of justice extracted from the jaws of injustice fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happened on that Midsummer Night has been deliberately erased from every official record for nearly 2 centuries. The estate bell clanged at 4:30 that morning, its bronze voice calling field hands to another day of labor under Georgia's merciless sun. But Thomas heard different harmonics in that mechanical summons. He heard his wife Grace screaming as Silas Blackwood sold her to a passing trader 2 months prior, separating them after 20 years of marriage because she dared to request lighter work after injuring her back. He heard his son Isaiah's last words before being shipped to the sugar fields of Louisiana, where life expectancy measured in seasons rather than years. He heard 37 years of bitten tongues and swallowed words, of bowed heads and shuffled steps, of saying yes sir and no sir to men who wouldn't recognize human dignity if it rose up and throttled them. Every suppressed scream, every hidden tear, every moment of enforced deference had accumulated like sediment in his soul until it formed bedrock hard enough to support the weight of what came next. The Blackwood Estate operated with the mechanical precision of a Swiss timepiece, each component serving the singular purpose of extracting maximum profit from minimum investment. Master Edmund Blackwood ruled from his mahogany desk, where bourbon-stained ledgers tracked productivity metrics with obsessive detail. Every bale of cotton picked, every acre planted, every dollar spent on food rations appeared in columns that told stories in numbers rather than names. The estate's 300 enslaved workers existed as line items in those ledgers, their value calculated against their productive capacity minus maintenance costs. When the equation no longer balanced favorably, they were sold south to the killing fields of sugar and rice plantations where life expectancy dropped faster than Georgia temperatures in January. Silas Blackwood served as his uncle's instrument of enforcement, translating profit margins into human suffering with the creativity of an artist working in flesh and fear. At 28 years old, he'd already earned a reputation among neighboring plantations for maintaining discipline through methods that made even hardened overseers uncomfortable. His whip sang daily hymns across backs that bore the accumulated sheet music of his tenure, while his voice carried the casual authority of someone who'd never questioned his right to inflict pain on human beings he considered barely human at all. The punishment swamp had been Silas's innovation, implemented after studying plantation management techniques from across the Deep South. Traditional whipping proved effective but temporary, he argued, in letters to agricultural journals that circulated among the planter class. Pain faded. Scars healed. But terror embedded in the deepest parts of the mind, terror associated with specific places and experiences, created lasting behavioral modifications. The swamp section he designated for punishment sat a quarter-mile behind the main house, accessible only by a narrow footpath that wound through dense vegetation. Cypress trees formed a natural cage where water ran waist-deep even during dry seasons. Alligators claimed this territory as prime hunting ground, their bellows echoing through the night like demons calling roll in hell's antechamber. Silas would secure infractions to the sturdiest trees, leaving them standing in dark water while creatures circled and mosquitoes feasted. Sometimes he'd leave them for hours, sometimes overnight. The psychological damage proved more effective than any whip, creating workers who jumped at shadows and obeyed without hesitation, rather than risk another night in the place where screams went unanswered. Thomas had witnessed the punishment swamp's effects firsthand, watching strong men emerge as hollow shells who startled at sudden movements and spoke in whispers even when no overseers lurked nearby. He'd seen women return to the quarters with infection festering and countless insect bites, their eyes carrying the haunted look of people who'd stared into darkness and found it staring back. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But Silas's cruelty extended beyond innovative punishment techniques. He took particular pleasure in separating families, recognizing that emotional bonds represented leverage that could be exploited for maximum compliance. When Grace had requested lighter duty after injuring her back during cotton picking season, Silas had interpreted the request as insubordination requiring correction. He'd sold her the following week to a trader passing through Savannah, accepting below market price because the message sent to other workers exceeded the financial loss. Thomas had been forced to watch as his wife of 20 years climbed into the wagon that would carry her to Mississippi cotton fields. Silas had smiled throughout the transaction, occasionally glancing at Thomas to ensure he witnessed every moment of the separation. The sale of their son Isaiah had occurred 3 months earlier, motivated by nothing more than Silas catching the young man teaching other workers their letters, using a Bible smuggled from the main house. Literacy among enslaved workers represented a threat to the entire system, Silas explained to his uncle while arranging the sale. The Louisiana sugar plantation that purchased Isaiah specialized in working young men to death in fields where malaria and overwork competed to see which could kill faster. From the Blackwood Estate ledgers, June 15, 1852, sold to Murphy's Sugar Company one Negro male, approximately 22 years, strong back, good teeth. Price received $950. Note: worker demonstrated dangerous tendencies toward literacy. Recommend increased vigilance regarding educational materials in quarters. The ledger entry reduced Isaiah's entire existence to a financial transaction and security memo, his humanity erased by ink that documented profit and loss with clinical detachment. But those numbers couldn't capture Grace's sobbing into corn husk mattresses, or Thomas's hands clenching into fists he couldn't raise, or the slow accumulation of rage that built like pressure behind a dam, waiting for one final crack to unleash catastrophic flooding. The Blackwood family history stretched back 3 generations in Georgia, built on fortunes accumulated through systematic brutality disguised as agricultural entrepreneurship. Edmund Blackwood's grandfather had purchased the original 1,000 acres in 1798, clearing swampland and planting the first cotton crops that would finance the estate's expansion. Each subsequent generation added acreage, workers, and refinements to the machinery of human exploitation. Edmund himself had inherited the estate at age 35, immediately implementing modernization strategies that increased productivity while reducing per-unit labor costs. He subscribed to agricultural journals, attended planter conventions, and networked with other estate owners to share best practices in worker management. His correspondence with Silas, preserved in family archives that would later be donated to the Georgia Historical Society, revealed a man who saw enslaved workers as capital investments requiring proper maintenance to maximize return. But here's what separated the Blackwood estate from neighboring plantations: the systematic use of psychological warfare alongside physical punishment. Silas had studied the breaking of human spirits with the same diligence others applied to crop rotation schedules. He understood that terror proved more effective than simple pain, that uncertainty created more compliance than predictable punishment, that destroying hope worked better than destroying bodies. The other enslaved workers on the estate lived in constant state of calculated anxiety, never knowing which infractions would draw mild correction and which would result in nights in the punishment swamp. Silas deliberately varied his responses to identical behaviors, creating an environment where survival required perfect obedience because the rules themselves shifted like swamp water, undermining solid ground. Thomas had watched this system operate for 5 years, studying its patterns with the focus of someone planning to dismantle it piece by piece. He'd noted how Silas patrolled the same routes at the same times, how his confidence in the system's stability made him careless about personal safety, how 37 years of unchallenged authority had convinced him that enslaved workers would never pose actual threats. Every habit represented a vulnerability, every routine created an opportunity, and Thomas had been cataloging them all with the patience of someone who understood that justice delayed could become justice refined to surgical precision. Thomas's earliest memory involved the smell of tobacco leaves curing in his mother's arms, her work-roughened hands gentle despite the day's labor that had bent her back and bloodied her fingers. He remembered her singing spirituals in a voice that could make overseers pause and feel something uncomfortably close to recognition of shared humanity. Those songs spoke of rivers to cross and trains to catch, coded messages about escape, wrapped in melodies that white ears heard as simple religious devotion. She'd taught him to read using a borrowed Bible, conducting lessons in whispers after the other workers slept, her finger tracing words by candlelight that cost precious pennies from her vegetable garden sales. Education was forbidden, dangerous, potentially fatal if discovered, but she'd insisted that words held power, that whips couldn't reach, that knowledge lived in places beyond the master's control. The trader's wagon had arrived on a humid August morning, when Thomas was 8 years old. His mother had known something was wrong when the master called her to the main house, had gripped Thomas's hand with desperate strength that left marks he could still feel decades later. The sale happened quickly. Business concluded with handshakes and cash that changed hands while Thomas screamed and his mother's voice rose in spirituals that cracked like breaking glass. He'd watched her figure shrink into the distance as the wagon carried him toward a tobacco plantation in North Carolina, her hand raised in farewell or blessing or final goodbye. That image remained frozen in his memory, with perfect clarity, the last time he'd seen the woman who'd given him life and the tools to understand what slavery truly meant. The North Carolina plantation had belonged to a man named Cornelius Webb who specialized in breaking young workers early, establishing patterns of obedience that would last a lifetime. Thomas spent 3 years under Webb's management, learning that survival required the appearance of docility while maintaining interior spaces where rage could accumulate undisturbed. He'd mastered the shuffle and the downcast eyes, the "yes, sir," delivered with perfect timing, the ability to become invisible through perfect conformity to expectations. Webb had sold him at age 11 to a rice plantation in South Carolina, where malaria killed workers faster than overwork, where the fields flooded with brackish water that hosted mosquitoes in numbers that seemed biblical. Thomas survived through a combination of luck and the constitution his mother had bequeathed him, but he'd watched dozens die screaming with fever or simply slip beneath the water's surface and not resurface. The rice plantation's overseer had been a man named Samuel Pierce, who believed that enslaved workers required constant physical correction to maintain productivity. His whip had carved the roadmap of scars across Thomas's back, each raised line telling stories in flesh about infractions real and imagined. Talking during work hours, moving too slowly, meeting another worker's eyes, looking insufficiently subservient. The reasons multiplied like mosquitoes breeding in standing water. But Pierce had made one crucial mistake that would echo across decades. He'd taught Thomas to track runaways through the surrounding swampland, recognizing his natural talent for reading signs in disturbed vegetation and mud. Pierce needed someone who could navigate terrain that killed white men, someone expendable who could be sent into environments where cottonmouths and alligators claimed more victims than any overseer's whip. Thomas had learned the swamp's languages, its rhythms and patterns, where solid ground ended and sinkhole began, which channels led to escape routes, and which dead-ended in alligator nesting grounds. He'd studied the great predators with the focus of someone who recognized kindred spirits, creatures that survived through patience and explosive violence applied at precisely the right moment. At age 20, he'd been sold again when Pierce's plantation failed during an economic downturn that saw rice prices collapse and creditors circle like buzzards over dying livestock. The Savannah slave market had processed him like any other commodity, stripped to the waist for inspection, teeth examined, back scars noted in auction records that documented his history of, quote, correction. Master Blackwood had purchased him for his tracking abilities, his knowledge of waterways, his proven capacity to survive in environments that swallowed weaker men. The price paid, $850, appeared in ledgers that reduced Thomas's entire existence to a single line item between entries for farm equipment and livestock purchases. He'd met Grace during his second week on the Blackwood Estate, a woman whose quiet strength reminded him of his mother's resilience. She worked in the main house as a seamstress, her skilled fingers creating the fine clothing that plantation families wore, while enslaved workers dressed in Osnaburg rough enough to draw blood from sensitive skin. Their courtship had happened in stolen moments between work shifts. Conversations whispered in the quarters after the overseers retired. They'd jumped the broom in a ceremony the estate allowed because married workers proved more stable, less likely to attempt escape when emotional bonds tied them to specific locations. The master had even provided extra rations for the celebration, a gesture of beneficence that cost him pennies while buying loyalty worth dollars. Isaiah had been born the following year, arriving during cotton picking season, when Grace's labor pains competed with the demands of meeting daily quotas. Thomas had held his son for the first time with hands still stained from the day's work, feeling emotions that slavery supposedly couldn't accommodate. Love, hope, desperate fear about bringing new life into a system designed to grind it down. He'd watched Isaiah grow from infant to young man, witnessed the moment when his son's eyes lost their innocence, and gained the haunted awareness that came with understanding his permanent station in life. That transition happened earlier for some than others, triggered by the first casual cruelty that couldn't be explained away, or the first separation witnessed between parent and offspring. For Isaiah, the moment had arrived at age 7 when he'd watched Silas Blackwood whip another worker for the crime of looking him directly in the eyes. Something had shifted in the boy's expression, a door closing on childhood, while adult comprehension of systematic evil flooded in to fill the void. From Thomas's perspective, preserved in oral histories collected decades later by researchers documenting slavery's lived experiences, you watch your son learn what he is in their eyes, and something breaks inside you that can't ever heal right. He asked me why the overseer could do that, and I had no answer that wouldn't make things worse. So I told him to be good, work hard, keep his head down. And I hated myself for teaching him to accept what should never be accepted. The accumulated weight of 37 years of such moments had created geological pressure that required only the right trigger to explode into catastrophic violence. Grace's sale had been the penultimate crack in the dam. Isaiah's sale had opened the floodgates, but the final trigger, the moment that transformed planning into action, had been smaller and somehow more devastating. 3 days after Isaiah's sale, Thomas had found his son's carved wooden horse floating in the punishment swamp's dark water. Isaiah had spent months crafting the toy during brief evening hours, when exhaustion didn't claim him completely, working wood smooth with stolen tools and infinite patience. The horse represented the only possession the young man had truly owned, created by his own hands for his own pleasure. Silas Blackwood had thrown it into the swamp as a casual afterthought following Isaiah's sale, disposing of property that no longer served any purpose. The gesture carried no particular malice, just the thoughtless cruelty of someone who'd never considered that enslaved people formed attachments to objects the same way white folks did. Thomas had waded into the black water to retrieve the wooden horse, holding it with reverence usually reserved for religious relics. The carved mane remained perfect despite its submersion. The smooth flanks still bore the marks of Isaiah's careful work. And in that moment, staring at his son's final creation, Thomas felt something fundamental shift inside himself. Some cruelties cut deeper than whips. Some losses couldn't be endured without fundamental transformation. And some debts could only be settled with reciprocal destruction that matched the original crime's magnitude. He'd kept the wooden horse, wrapped carefully in canvas and hidden in a hollow tree near the quarters. And he'd begun planning Silas Blackwood's execution with the same methodical patience his son had applied to wood carving. Every detail mattered. Every variable required consideration. Because justice delayed until it could be executed perfectly was still justice, just refined until it cut with surgical precision. The swampland behind the Blackwood Estate stretched for miles in every direction, a primordial maze where water and land negotiated constantly shifting boundaries. Thomas had spent 5 years mapping every channel, every sinkhole, every alligator nest in this 10-square-mile labyrinth of cypress and blackwater. He knew where the current ran strongest during spring floods, where hidden springs created sudden drop-offs that could swallow a man whole, where the big bulls claimed territory and defended it with prehistoric fury. His knowledge had been purchased with scars and near-death experiences, accumulated through hundreds of tracking expeditions, where one wrong step meant disappearing into environments that erased mistakes with permanent efficiency. He'd learned to read the water's surface for subsurface hazards, to identify safe passage through seemingly identical channels, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated alligator presence versus absence. The great predators fascinated him with their patient violence, their ability to remain motionless for hours before exploding into action that transformed stillness into death in less than 3 heartbeats. He'd watched them take wild hogs and deer, studied their hunting patterns with the focus of someone who recognized useful instruction in their methods. Alligators didn't waste energy on unnecessary movement. They calculated distances with mathematical precision. They struck when success became inevitable, rather than merely possible. Thomas had adopted their philosophy, applying it to planning that stretched across 3 months of meticulous preparation. Every variable received consideration. Every potential complication demanded contingency planning. Because unlike the alligators he studied, he would only get one opportunity to execute justice before the system's full weight crashed down in retaliation. The rope he'd acquired came from the estate's supply shed, requisitioned officially for tracking purposes but selected for specific characteristics that served different functions. Hemp twisted tight enough to hold against sustained pulling force, treated with beeswax to resist water damage, measuring exactly 15 feet in length. He'd tested it repeatedly in secret, wrapping it around cypress trunks and pulling with his full weight to ensure it would hold when violence transformed theoretical planning into practical application. The bait selection required more careful consideration. Alligators responded to blood scent and movement, preferring live prey but willing to investigate anything that suggested easy feeding. Thomas had stolen raw chicken from the estate's smokehouse over several weeks, taking small amounts that wouldn't trigger inventory investigations. The meat rode in his satchel now, wrapped in canvas to contain the smell until deployment became necessary. But the most crucial component of his planning involved understanding Silas Blackwood's patterns with the precision of a naturalist documenting animal behavior. The overseer followed predictable routes during his daily inspections, checking on field workers with clockwork regularity that reflected his obsessive need for control. Every morning at 6 o'clock, he rode the perimeter trail that separated cultivated fields from swampland wilderness. Every afternoon at 2, he inspected the quarters for infractions that might require correction. And every 3rd day, he personally checked the punishment swamp to ensure the area remained suitable for its designated purpose. That pattern created a window of opportunity that Thomas had been waiting to exploit, a moment when Silas would be isolated in terrain where Thomas held every advantage and the overseer possessed none. From the personal journal of Edmund Blackwood, June 19, 1852, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, Silas reports excellent discipline among the workers. His methods, while occasionally severe, produce results that justify the approach. Productivity metrics continue exceeding regional averages. The punishment swamp innovation deserves documentation in agricultural journals as best practice for worker management. The journal entry revealed how completely the Blackwood family had convinced themselves that brutality served noble purposes, that systematic cruelty represented scientific management rather than moral bankruptcy. Edmund's clinical language transformed human suffering into data points, reduced screams to productivity metrics that could be graphed and analyzed for efficiency improvements. But here's what the official records couldn't capture: the network of silent witnesses who'd observed Thomas's preparations and chosen to see nothing. Samuel, the stablemaster, had noticed extra rope disappearing from inventory, but adjusted his counts to hide the discrepancy. Hannah, who worked the smokehouse, had watched Thomas pocket chicken scraps over multiple weeks yet never reported the theft. Old Benjamin, the blacksmith whose forge stood near the swamp's edge, had seen Thomas testing rope strength against cypress trees, but offered fresh water without asking questions that demanded answers. The conspiracy of silence extended across the quarters like invisible webbing, connecting people who shared understanding that some knowledge proved too dangerous for words. Every worker on the estate had suffered under Silas Blackwood's innovations in cruelty. Every person had watched families torn apart, bodies broken, spirits systematically destroyed, and every soul recognized that Thomas carried accumulated rage on behalf of 300 people who couldn't risk acting themselves. They provided cover through strategic blindness, creating gaps in the surveillance network that plantation discipline required. When Thomas needed to scout the swamp during work hours, others picked up his slack in the fields without complaint. When he requisitioned supplies that raised potential questions, inventory keepers developed convenient memory lapses. When he needed alibis for time spent in locations that might attract overseer attention, witnesses materialized with stories that placed him elsewhere. The network operated without explicit organization, guided by shared understanding that transcended the need for dangerous conversations. Some resistance happened through dramatic gestures that attracted historical attention, but most happened through small acts of strategic incompetence, carefully cultivated ignorance, and the willingness to see nothing when seeing something might prevent justice from finding its target. Miriam, who cooked for the main house, had her own role to play in the plan's execution. She'd carefully cultivated Mrs. Blackwood's trust over 15 years of service, becoming indispensable through competence that made the mistress's life comfortable enough to overlook occasional small infractions. That trust granted Miriam access to the main house schedule, knowledge about when Edmund would be traveling to Savannah on business, when Mrs. Blackwood would be occupied with social obligations that demanded her presence elsewhere. June 21st had been selected with astronomical precision. Midsummer Night, when the moon would rise full and bright enough to illuminate the swamp's pathways while casting shadows deep enough to hide movement from casual observation. Edmund Blackwood would be in Savannah, attending a planters' convention, discussing crop prices and labor management techniques with other estate owners. Mrs. Blackwood would be hosting her weekly prayer circle, an afternoon gathering that stretched into evening and provided convenient cover for Thomas's absence from the quarters. Silas followed his established pattern with mechanical predictability, checking the punishment swamp every third day to ensure it remained suitable for its designated purpose. The timing aligned perfectly, all variables converging like tumblers in a lock, clicking into position to permit one brief window of opportunity. Thomas had also studied the alligators inhabiting the punishment swamp with scientific rigor, identifying the dominant bull that claimed prime territory near the deepest channel. The massive creature measured 14 feet from snout to tail, easily 500 pounds of muscle and bone powered by instincts older than human civilization. He'd observed it taking a wild boar 2 weeks earlier, the attack executed with such explosive violence that the pig barely had time to squeal before disappearing beneath dark water that churned red with displaced blood. The bull had claimed a partially submerged log as its primary ambush position, a location that offered perfect cover while providing clear approach lanes to areas where prey animals came to drink. Thomas had memorized the exact distances involved, calculating the kill zone with mathematical precision. 15 feet from the log's end, the water depth dropped, from waist-high to over the head in a single step. 12 feet represented the outer boundary of the bull's explosive striking range, tested through observation of multiple hunts. The plan required positioning Silas in that precise sweet spot where escape became impossible and death arrived with mechanical certainty. Too close, and the alligator might attack before Thomas could retreat to safety. Too far, and Silas might find purchase on submerged routes that would allow him to resist being dragged into deeper water. The mathematics demanded perfection because there would be no opportunity for adjustment once events began unfolding. But Thomas had also prepared for potential complications that might derail even perfect planning. He'd identified 3 escape routes from the punishment swamp, paths that would allow rapid withdrawal if search parties materialized earlier than expected. He'd cached supplies at strategic locations. Dry clothes to replace waterlogged garments that would slow movement, food to sustain energy during potential extended evasion, tools that might prove necessary for survival in the deep swamp. The possibility of failure haunted his planning like Spanish moss draping from cypress branches. If Silas escaped, or if witnesses appeared at the wrong moment, Thomas would face execution by hanging in Savannah's public square. The spectacle would draw thousands of spectators eager to watch the system reassert its authority through ritualized killing designed to terrorize other enslaved workers into continued submission. But even that worst-case scenario held appeal compared to continuing existence under Silas Blackwood's calculated cruelty. Some lives reached points where death appeared preferable to another day of swallowed rage and enforced subservience. Thomas had crossed that threshold when he'd pulled Isaiah's wooden horse from the Blackwater, feeling something fundamental break inside himself that couldn't be repaired through hope or endurance. From oral histories collected in 1937 by the Federal Writers Project, interviewing formerly enslaved people about their experiences, my grandfather told me about a man named Thomas who worked the Blackwood Estate before the war. Said Thomas knew the swamp better than any white man alive, could track anything through water that would swallow you whole if you didn't know the paths. Said one day the overseer went into that swamp and never came back out. Some folks said alligators got him. Some said the swamp just took what it was owed. The oral tradition preserved what official records erased, passing down stories that courthouse documents deliberately excluded from historical narratives. Thomas's name survived in whispered conversations and carefully coded songs, remembered by descendants who understood that some justice happened outside legal frameworks that defined justice itself as property of those who owned human beings. The sun climbed toward its zenith on June 21st as Thomas made final preparations, checking rope coils and bait placement with the focus of someone who understood that details separated success from catastrophic failure. His hands remained steady despite the enormity of what approached, decades of enforced composure serving him well in moments that demanded absolute control over visible emotion. Around him the swamp pulsed with life indifferent to human concerns. Cicadas sang their endless summer chorus, while tree frogs added percussion that echoed off cypress bark. Somewhere in the distance, the bull alligator bellowed territorial claims that resonated through Thomas's chest, like distant thunder-promising storms that would wash away accumulated sins. Everything was ready. The trap had been set with precision that would have impressed the agricultural scientists who studied crop optimization. But this harvest would yield different fruits than cotton or tobacco, would produce justice measured in screams rather than pounds, would balance scales that had tipped toward cruelty for 37 years. Silas Blackwood would arrive within the hour, following patterns so predictable that Thomas could set a timepiece by his movements. And in the green cathedral, where Spanish moss filtered sunlight into golden shafts that danced across black water, ancient hunger prepared to receive offerings that the system itself had cultivated through generations of systematic brutality. Some debts could only be paid in blood and brackish water. Some justice required teeth older than human law. And some reckonings arrived with the patient inevitability of alligators that had learned to wait, because waiting always rewarded those who understood its disciplines. Silas Blackwood's horse appeared through the morning haze at precisely 6:45, its hoofbeats muffled by the crushed oyster shell path that skirted the swamp's western edge. The overseer sat his saddle with the casual authority of someone who'd never questioned his right to inflict suffering on human beings he considered barely human at all. His leather riding boots gleamed with fresh polish despite the humidity that turned everything else damp and moldy. The bullwhip coiled at his hip, swayed with the horse's movement, a constant reminder of power that required no justification beyond the color of skin, and the contents of legal documents that define some people as property. Thomas waded in water that reached his waist, his body positioned exactly where Silas would expect to find his best tracker. The morning mist clung to the surface like guilty secrets, trying to avoid sunlight's exposure, while somewhere deeper in the swamp, the bull alligator's territorial bellow echoed through cypress trunks, with the resonance of church bells calling the faithful to worship. The sound carried implications that Silas's ears couldn't interpret, warnings that Thomas understood with the fluency of someone who'd studied the swamp's languages for 5 years. The bull had begun its morning hunt, moving from nighttime resting areas toward prime ambush positions where prey animals came to drink from channels that promised water but delivered death. Silas guided his mount to the trail's edge, where solid ground surrendered to the swamp's wet embrace. The horse snorted nervously, its prey animal instincts recognizing dangers that its rider's arrogance dismissed. Steam rose from the animal's flanks as morning heat began its assault on the day, turning the air thick enough to chew and heavy enough to make breathing feel like work. "Any sign of them runaways, boy?" Silas called out, his voice carrying the casual contempt of a man addressing furniture rather than humanity. He remained mounted, maintaining the height advantage that reinforced the power dynamics he'd spent 3 years establishing through systematic cruelty. Thomas moved closer with deliberate slowness, his bare feet finding purchase on submerged roots that could trip someone unfamiliar with their precise locations. The rope coiled around his shoulder remained partially concealed beneath the torn shirt that plantation workers wore, until fabric literally disintegrated from wear and washing. "Yes, sir, Master Silas," Thomas replied, his voice pitched to carry deference that masked calculation running beneath the surface like underground rivers that could drown the unwary. "Found their trail leading deeper into the swamp, but there's something else you need to see. Something strange near the old cypress stand." The bait was simple, relying on Silas's need to control every aspect of estate operations down to the smallest detail. Any anomaly demanded investigation. Any deviation from expected patterns required correction. The overseer's obsessive management style had made him effective at maximizing productivity through terror, but it also created predictable responses that could be exploited by someone patient enough to study the patterns. Silas dismounted with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with horses and riding, tying his mount to a cypress knee that jutted from the water like a gnarled finger pointing toward sky. The animal's eyes rolled white with nervous energy, nostrils flaring as it caught scents that triggered ancestral memories of predators that had hunted horses, evolutionary ancestors through primordial wetlands. "Show me," Silas commanded, his hand resting on the whip handle with unconscious authority. He'd never entered the deep swamp without Thomas as guide, recognizing his own limitations in terrain that swallowed white men who ventured beyond their expertise. The irony was perfect. His dependence on Thomas's knowledge would facilitate his own destruction. They moved deeper into the swamp along paths that existed only for those who knew where to look, stepping from submerged root to hidden sandbar, with the precision of dancers following choreography, practiced until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. The water level rose gradually as they progressed, climbing from ankle-deep to knee-deep to the waist-high current that marked the boundary between accessible wetland and true wilderness. Silas followed without question, trusting the system that had never failed him, confident in his authority over someone he'd reduced to the status of useful tool. His expensive leather boots filled and emptied with each step, making squashing sounds that echoed off cypress trunks like applause for performance art that would end in violence. The morning sun climbed higher, filtering through the canopy in golden shafts that transformed the swamp into a cathedral where Spanish moss hung like prayer shawls and water reflected light with the quality of stained glass. Birdsong provided the soundtrack. Red-shouldered hawks calling territorial claims, wood ducks chattering in protected channels, great blue herons croaking their prehistoric warnings about trespass in sacred spaces. "How much further?" Silas demanded, his breath coming harder now as exertion combined with humidity to tax even his relatively young constitution. At 28, he maintained the physical fitness that came from daily horseback riding and regular violence against people who couldn't fight back, but the swamp's demands exceeded gymnasium exercises and casual brutality. "Just ahead, sir," Thomas replied, gesturing toward a section where the channel narrowed between massive cypress trunks that created natural funnels. "Near the big log where we found those runaways last spring, something's different about the water level, and there's signs of recent activity." The lie flowed smoothly, practiced through decades of telling white folks what they needed to hear to maintain illusions of control. Thomas had become fluent in the language of strategic deception, understanding that survival often depended on making masters believe they commanded complete knowledge while carefully curating what information reached their awareness. They approached the kill zone with Thomas leading and Silas following, reversing the power dynamics that governed every other aspect of their relationship. Here, in terrain that Thomas had mapped with obsessive precision, the overseer's authority meant nothing. Knowledge trumped legal documents. Expertise exceeded the power granted by skin color and institutional backing. And accumulated rage sharpened focus until it could cut through pretense with surgical precision. The partially submerged log that served as the bull alligator's primary ambush position lay 30 feet ahead, its dark bulk barely distinguishable from the water's surface. Thomas had confirmed the creature's presence earlier that morning, watching its eyes break the surface like amber coins reflecting dawn light. The massive predator waited with the patience of something that had outlived countless prey animals, secure in the knowledge that hunger always found satisfaction for those willing to wait. Silas's attention remained focused on Thomas's back, missing the subtle signs that someone trained in swamp languages would have recognized immediately. The sudden absence of birdsong as smaller creatures detected the apex predator's presence. The circular ripples that marked the bull's breathing. The way floating vegetation created patterns that suggested something large displacing water beneath the surface. "I don't see anything unusual," Silas said, irritation creeping into his voice. He disliked wasting time on investigations that produced no actionable intelligence, preferred concrete problems that could be addressed through whip application, or other forms of correction that reinforced his authority. Thomas turned to face him, and for the first time in 5 years of forced interaction, allowed his expression to shift from subservience to something harder and infinitely more dangerous. The mask that had protected him through decades of bondage slipped enough to reveal the accumulated rage burning beneath the surface like coal seams that could smolder for generations before erupting into conflagration. "That's because you never learned to see what matters," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying none of the deference that Silas had come to expect as natural as sunrise. "You look at swamps and see obstacles. You look at people and see property. You look at the world and see only what serves your purposes." Silas's hand moved toward his whip with reflexive speed, muscle memory responding to insubordination that demanded immediate correction. But Thomas was faster, had been preparing for this moment through 3 months of planning that accounted for every variable. The rope moved like a striking snake, its noose dropping over Silas's head and pulling tight before shock could transform into resistance. The overseer's eyes widened with the dawning comprehension that power had shifted, that legal authority meant nothing in spaces where only survival mattered, that 37 years of accumulated suffering had finally found its target. His hands clawed at hemp that bit deeper with every struggle, cutting into skin that had never known the kiss of restraints designed to transform human beings into livestock. "What are you doing?" Silas gasped, the words emerging strangled and desperate. "You'll hang for this. They'll hang every last one of you." Thomas pulled the rope tighter, not enough to choke but sufficient to establish complete control over movement and breathing. His face remained calm, despite the chaos that would follow this moment. Decades of enforced composure serving him well when emotions threatened to overwhelm careful planning. "Maybe," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the weight of calculations that had already accounted for every possible consequence. "But you'll never sell another person's family. You'll never send another young man to sugar fields that kill in seasons. You'll never throw another child's toy into this water like it means nothing." The last statement carried such specific pain that even Silas, in his terror, recognized reference to something beyond general grievance. His mind raced through recent events, searching for the particular cruelty that had triggered this reversal of fortune. The wooden horse. Isaiah's carved toy. The casual disposal of property that had seemed meaningless at the time. "I can make this right," Silas whispered, desperation giving his voice qualities that Thomas had heard in the quarters after families were torn apart. "Money, freedom papers, whatever you want." Thomas's laugh was soft as settling sediment, gentle as Spanish moss swaying in breeze that carried the scent of decay and wild jasmine. "What I want, you sold to Louisiana sugar fields. What I want, you threw away like trash. What I want doesn't exist anymore because you destroyed it piece by piece until nothing remained but this moment." He began walking deeper into the swamp, pulling Silas behind him like a reluctant dog on a leash. The overseer stumbled through water that grew progressively deeper, his expensive boots losing purchase on submerged roots, slick with algae. Each step took them further from the world of plantations and legal documents, deeper into territory where alligators didn't read bills of sale and water moccasins struck whoever disturbed their rest. The bull alligator's eyes tracked their approach with the calculating patience of apex predators that had perfected ambush hunting across millions of years of evolution. Its massive tail swept slowly beneath the surface, creating pressure waves that Thomas felt against his legs like the heartbeat of the swamp itself. Somewhere behind them, Silas's horse whinnied nervously before the sound cut off abruptly, suggesting the animal had broken its tether and fled toward the safety of open fields where familiar smells replaced the swamp's threatening unknowns. The noise would attract no attention, interpreted as normal equine behavior rather than warning about violence unfolding in the green cathedral's deepest shadows. Thomas secured the rope to a sturdy cypress trunk, leaving Silas enough slack to move, but not enough to escape. The positioning was precise, calculated to place the overseer exactly 12 feet from the submerged log where death waited with prehistoric patience. "You don't understand what you're doing," Silas said, his voice cracking like autumn leaves as he finally recognized the trap's true nature. "I'm not your enemy. The system is your enemy. I just enforce the rules." Thomas met his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd spent 37 years perfecting the art of appearing harmless while nurturing rage that could melt steel. "You are the system," he replied, each word carved from accumulated grief and polished by decades of swallowed responses. "Every whip stroke, every family separation, every night in this swamp you use for breaking spirits. You're not following orders. You're the reason the orders exist." The truth settled between them like sediment, heavy and inescapable. And in the water 12 feet away, ancient appetite stirred to wakefulness as blood sent from rope burns mixed with the sweat of terror that seasoned prey better than any cook could manage with herbs and spices. The cypress shadows lengthened as morning surrendered to midday heat, transforming the swamp into a pressure cooker where humidity pressed down with physical weight. Silas Blackwood stood bound to the tree trunk, his fine cotton shirt now transparent with sweat and marsh water that had soaked through expensive fabric never designed for immersion in environments where gentlemen feared to tread. The rope burns on his neck wept clear fluid that attracted mosquitoes in clouds thick enough to obscure vision, their collective whine providing soundtrack to a reversal of fortune that defied every assumption he'd built his worldview upon. Thomas sat on a cypress knee 15 feet distant, close enough to prevent escape, but far enough to avoid the thrashing that would inevitably come when the bull alligator made its intentions known. His knife rested across his knees, not for violence but for the final cut that would free Silas to meet his fate, unencumbered by restraints. The blade had been honed to razor sharpness on the estate's whetstone, borrowed legitimately for maintaining tools used in tracking work that now served purposes its owners never imagined. The positioning created a tableau that might have appeared in abolitionist literature if artists had witnessed it: the bound overseer and the calm enslaved man reversed from expected roles. But this wasn't performance designed for northern audiences who consumed slave narratives with their morning coffee. This was mathematics working itself out in flesh and fear, equations that demanded balancing through methods that legal systems built on human bondage could never accommodate. "My family will search for me," Silas said, his voice carrying less conviction now as reality penetrated the shock that had initially numbed his thinking. "My uncle employs 200 workers who depend on estate income. You're destroying their livelihoods along with mine." Thomas's expression didn't change, his face maintaining the neutral mask that had protected him through decades of enforced interaction with people who mistook compliance for contentment. "Those 200 workers you mention," he replied quietly, his tone carrying no more emotion than if discussing weather patterns. "They're not employed. They're owned. And their livelihoods, as you call them, consist of working until their bodies break while watching their families get sold away piece by piece." The distinction landed with the weight of fundamental truth that Silas had spent his entire life avoiding through careful use of euphemistic language. Employment suggested choice, wages, the ability to seek better opportunities elsewhere. Ownership meant something entirely different, a relationship where one human being's entire existence served another's profit calculations, with no consideration beyond productive capacity and replacement costs. "The system provides for them," Silas countered, grasping at arguments he'd heard repeated in parlors and published in agricultural journals that treated human bondage as economic necessity rather than moral catastrophe. "They receive food, shelter, medical care when needed. Many are better off than northern factory workers who starve in tenements." Thomas's laugh emerged soft as Spanish moss swaying in breeze that carried the scent of decay. "You actually believe that? You've convinced yourself that stealing people's lives represents kindness, because you provide the minimum necessary to keep them alive enough to work." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting Silas's with directness that would have earned whipping in any other context. "Tell me, Master Silas, when was the last time someone sold your wife to a passing trader because she requested lighter work after injury? When did armed men separate you from your son and ship him to fields where he'll likely die before turning 30? When did anyone throw away your most precious possession like worthless trash?" The questions hung in humid air like accusations that couldn't be dismissed through legal arguments or economic justifications. Each one pointed toward specific cruelties that Silas had inflicted, while convincing himself he was simply managing labor resources with appropriate discipline. From the Diary of Edmund Blackwood, June 10, 1852, Silas's management techniques continue producing excellent results. Some neighboring planters question his methods as excessively harsh, but productivity metrics demonstrate their effectiveness. Sentiment must not override sound business practices. The workers are ultimately better served by firm discipline than permissive management that leads to chaos. The journal entry revealed how completely the Blackwood family had embraced rationalizations that transformed brutality into business strategy, reduced human suffering to acceptable costs in pursuit of profit margins that funded their comfortable lives. Edmund's clinical language created distance between actions and consequences, allowing him to sleep soundly in beds made comfortable by money earned through systematic destruction of families and spirits. But here in the swamp, where Spanish moss filtered sunlight into green gold shafts and alligators waited with patient hunger, those rationalizations dissolved like morning mist exposed to harsh truth. The distance collapsed. The consequences arrived in person, delivered by someone who'd been studying revenge, with the same focus that planters applied to crop rotation schedules and soil chemistry. "I was following the law," Silas insisted, his voice rising with desperation that made the rope bite deeper into neck flesh already raw from struggling. "Everything I did was legal, sanctioned by the state, approved by courts and churches. You can't hold me responsible for enforcing legitimate authority." Thomas stood slowly, his movement deliberate as a preacher, approaching a pulpit to deliver sermons about judgment and reckoning. "The law," he said, his voice carrying weight accumulated through 37 years of living under legal frameworks that defined him as property. "The law says I'm 3/5 of a person for census purposes, but whole property for sale transactions. The law says my testimony doesn't count in court, but my labor counts toward your uncle's wealth. The law says you can whip me for looking at you wrong, but I can't defend myself when you violate my wife." He moved closer now, his bare feet finding purchase on submerged roots, with the confidence of someone who'd mapped this terrain in intimate detail. "So forgive me if I don't find much comfort in your appeals to legality. The law was written by people who profit from my suffering. It's not justice. It's just paperwork that makes theft and murder respectable." The argument struck at foundational assumptions that Silas had never questioned, raised possibilities that his entire worldview rested on foundations no more solid than swamp water that appeared stable until you tried standing on it. If the law itself was corrupt, if the system was designed to facilitate rather than prevent injustice, then what defense could he offer beyond acknowledging complicity in organized evil? "What about my soul?" Silas whispered, reaching for religious arguments when legal ones failed to gain traction. "Murder is a sin. You'll damn yourself eternally for this act." Thomas's smile carried no warmth, just the cold recognition of hypocrisy so profound it almost achieved artistic merit. "Your preachers blessed the ships that brought my ancestors here in chains. They quoted scripture to justify separating families. They took communion on Sundays, then sold human beings on Mondays without seeing contradiction." He gestured toward the water where the bull alligator's eyes had begun tracking movement with increased attention, calculating distances and approach angles with mathematical precision. "If there's a God who judges these things, I suspect he'll have questions for the people who built churches on plantations and used his name to sanctify buying and selling his children like livestock." The theological debate dissolved into silence, broken only by insect chorus and the distant sound of the bull alligator's breathing, a rhythmic hiss that suggested appetite awakening to possibilities. Silas had run through his available arguments, exhausted the rationalizations that had allowed him to sleep soundly despite inflicting suffering that would haunt any conscience not carefully insulated through layers of self-deception. But here's what transformed this moment from simple revenge into something more complex and troubling. Thomas felt no joy in Silas's terror, experienced no satisfaction in the power reversal that placed his tormentor at his mercy. The rope around Silas's neck represented necessity rather than pleasure, justice rather than sadistic gratification. He'd become what the system required him to become, transformed into an instrument of violence, because violence was the only language that slavery's architects understood. "I have a question for you," Thomas said after long silence filled only by swamp sounds and Silas's ragged breathing. "When you sold Grace to that Mississippi trader, did you feel anything? Remorse? Guilt? Anything at all that suggested you recognized her humanity?" Silas's face contorted with calculations that played across his features like weather patterns moving across open sky. He could lie, claim compassion he'd never felt in hopes of manipulating Thomas toward mercy. Or he could tell truth that might provide some measure of dignity in final moments that approached with inexorable certainty. "I felt," he began slowly, choosing words with care usually reserved for legal documents that required precision to avoid loopholes. "I felt that she needed correction for insubordination, that her sale would demonstrate to other workers the consequences of questioning authority, that discipline required consistency and follow-through." The answer revealed everything and nothing, exposed the complete absence of recognition that Grace existed as a person with interior life comparable to his own. She'd been reduced to a problem requiring solution, a management challenge that demanded correction through methods that happened to involve destroying a 20-year marriage and sending a woman to probable death in cotton fields that consumed workers like fuel-feeding insatiable engines. "Thank you for that honesty," Thomas said quietly, and meant it despite the fury that honesty triggered. "At least you're not pretending compassion you never felt. At least you're acknowledging that we're not people to you, just problems to be managed through application of sufficient cruelty." He pulled the raw chicken from his satchel, the meat now fragrant with decay that would carry through water like dinner bells calling the faithful to feasting. The bull alligator's attention sharpened immediately, its prehistoric brain recognizing opportunity that demanded investigation. Thomas tossed the chicken into the water 12 feet from Silas's position, close enough to attract the predator toward the kill zone, but not so close that immediate attack would prevent Thomas from retreating to safety. "What are you doing?" Silas asked, though the answer was becoming increasingly obvious as ripples spread from where the meat had entered water dark as old blood. "I'm feeding the swamp what it's owed," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the weight of calculations that extended beyond individual revenge toward something larger and more troubling. "You used this place to break spirits through terror. Seems appropriate that it should receive payment for services rendered." The bull alligator began moving with hydraulic precision, its massive body cutting through water that barely rippled, despite displacement that would have created waves from anything less perfectly adapted to aquatic ambush. 400 years of slavery's accumulated cruelty had created this moment, generated the pressure that found release through Thomas's careful planning and Silas's absolute certainty that the system would protect him from consequences. "Please," Silas whispered, the word emerging strangled and small. "I'll change. I'll free workers. I'll advocate for abolition. Just let me live, and I'll spend the rest of my life making amends." Thomas studied him with the detached interest of someone examining specimens under glass, noting the desperation that made promises cost nothing because they'd never require fulfillment. "How many people have begged you for mercy over the years? How many times did you hear pleas before the whip fell anyway? How many children watched their parents plead for families to stay together while you calculated sale prices that maximized profit?" The questions demanded no answers because answers had already been written in scars across backs and recorded in courthouse documents that treated human beings as chattel. Silas had built his career on deaf ears that heard suffering as background noise requiring no response, beyond ensuring it remained quiet enough not to disturb polite society's comfortable delusions. The chicken had disappeared beneath the surface, taken by the bull alligator in a display of power that sent tremors through the water like minor earthquakes announcing more catastrophic violence to come. The creature's appetite had been stimulated, its hunting instincts fully engaged. Now it circled closer, investigating the larger source of disturbance that stood 12 feet from its primary ambush position. Thomas backed away slowly, his movements calculated to avoid triggering the predator's attack response before reaching safe distance. The rope remained secured to the cypress trunk, holding Silas in position with mathematical precision that left just enough slack to create the illusion of potential escape, while ensuring any movement toward freedom only brought him closer to jaws that had evolved for gripping rather than cutting. "The thing about justice," Thomas said softly, his words almost lost beneath the rising chorus of evening insects beginning their nightly concert, "is that it doesn't care about intentions or rationalizations. It only cares about balancing scales that have tipped too far in one direction for too long." And in the water, where shadows gathered like mourners at a funeral, ancient hunger prepared to receive offerings that the system itself had cultivated through generations of calculated cruelty disguised as economic necessity. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the tree line when voices carried across the water like stones skipping across a still pond. High and clear, distinctly youthful, calling out with the kind of worry that only comes from genuine affection untainted by knowledge of the cruelties that affection's object had inflicted on others. Thomas's entire body went rigid as he recognized the voice of Silas's younger brother, 17-year-old Daniel Blackwood, accompanied by what sounded like two of the estate's younger house servants. "Silas, brother, where are you? Mama's worried sick about you missing supper." The words floated through cypress trunks and Spanish moss with innocent concern that had no conception of the justice being administered in the swamp's green cathedral. Daniel had arrived at the estate only 6 months prior, sent by his parents in Charleston to learn plantation management under his older brother's tutelage. The young man followed Silas with puppy-like devotion, absorbing lessons about labor discipline and productivity maximization, with the uncritical enthusiasm of someone too inexperienced to recognize systematic evil when it wore the mask of agricultural science. Thomas's hand tightened on the knife handle as calculations that had seemed perfect moments before suddenly sprouted complications like weeds in untended fields. The plan had accounted for Silas's isolation, for the predictable absence of witnesses during his scheduled inspection of the punishment swamp, for the conspiracy of silence that would allow hours to pass before anyone noticed the overseer's disappearance. But Daniel's unexpected presence threatened to transform execution into spectacle, to expose a 17-year-old to trauma that would shape the rest of his life in ways that no amount of time could heal. Silas's face transformed from terror to desperate hope as he recognized salvation approaching in the form of his younger brother. His mouth opened to scream, to call for help that would arrive in time to prevent the alligator's jaws from closing around justice too long delayed. But Thomas moved with the speed that came from tracking runaways through hostile terrain, his hand clamping over Silas's mouth before sound could escape and travel across water that carried voices with surprising clarity. "Don't," Thomas whispered, his voice carrying urgency that transcended the power dynamics that had governed their previous interaction. "Don't make him witness this. Don't put that weight on someone who's barely more than a boy himself." The statement hung between them like Spanish moss draping from branches, heavy with implications about what separated revenge from cruelty, justice from the kind of trauma that destroyed innocence as thoroughly as any whip destroyed flesh. Thomas had planned Silas's death with meticulous care, had prepared himself for the moral weight of taking a life even when that life had been spent inflicting suffering on others. But he hadn't prepared for the possibility of witnesses whose presence would transform private reckoning into public horror. The voices grew closer, Daniel's calls mixing with the servants', responses as they navigated the swamp's edge with the careful steps of people who understood the terrain's dangers but lacked the deep knowledge that would allow confident movement through its depths. They were perhaps 200 yards distant now, close enough that a loud scream would carry clearly, far enough that they couldn't yet see into the shadowed channels where Thomas held Silas in carefully calculated position. The bull alligator had gone completely still at the new sounds, its prehistoric brain processing information about multiple potential threats that might interfere with feeding opportunities. The massive creature remained submerged, except for eyes that reflected fading sunlight like amber coins, watching and waiting with the patience that had allowed its species to survive for millions of years through adaptation and strategic retreat when odds shifted unfavorably. Thomas faced an impossible calculation that fractured his careful planning into scenarios that offered no good options. He could release Silas now, allowing the overseer to call for help and escape with his life, while Thomas fled into the deep swamp, where pursuit would prove difficult but not impossible. That choice preserved Daniel's innocence but abandoned justice, left the scales unbalanced and Silas free to continue inflicting suffering on the 300 souls who labored under his calculated cruelty. Or he could complete the execution as planned, cutting the rope and allowing the alligator to take what the swamp was owed. But that choice risked Daniel arriving in time to witness his brother's death, to see the violence that would haunt his dreams for decades and potentially transform him into something harder and crueler than Silas had ever been. Trauma had a way of propagating itself across generations, turning victims into perpetrators who inflicted on others what had been inflicted on them. Or he could silence Silas permanently and immediately, using the knife to ensure no screams would betray their location while he withdrew into the swamp's depths before the search party arrived. But that option transformed him from instrument of justice into murderer, required direct killing rather than allowing nature to execute sentence through teeth that carried no moral weight beyond hunger and opportunity. What would you do, faced with justice that demanded sacrifice of innocence? When balancing scales required choosing between competing moral frameworks that offered no synthesis, only the selection of which principle to betray. The question wasn't rhetorical. It cut to the heart of what separated revenge from justice, personal satisfaction from systemic change, individual reckoning from the kind of transformation that might prevent future Silases from rising to positions where they could inflict suffering with legal sanction and social approval. "Please," Silas whispered against Thomas's palm, the word emerging muffled but comprehensible. "Don't let Daniel see this. He's just a boy. He hasn't done anything to deserve that burden." The appeal carried strange resonance coming from someone who'd shown no comparable concern for the burdens he'd placed on others. Isaiah had been younger than Daniel when he'd been sold to Louisiana sugar fields. The workers who spent nights in the punishment swamp had included teenagers barely old enough to understand why they were being tortured for infractions as minor as moving too slowly or failing to show sufficient deference. But Thomas recognized truth in the statement despite its source's hypocrisy. Daniel was 17, still forming the moral framework that would guide his adult life. Exposing him to his brother's violent death might harden him into something worse than Silas, might create someone who saw enslaved workers as dangerous animals, requiring even more brutal suppression to prevent future rebellions. Or it might break something fundamental in his spirit, leave him carrying guilt and trauma that would poison every relationship and decision for the rest of his existence. From oral histories collected decades later, interviewing people who'd witnessed slavery's final years, there was talk about young Master Daniel Blackwood, how he changed after his brother disappeared in the swamp. Some said he became harder, meaner, like he was trying to prove something. Others said he went the other way, started questioning the whole system after seeing what it cost. Either way, that day in the swamp marked him permanent, changed his trajectory in ways that rippled out for years. The historical record confirmed that moments like these carried weight beyond their immediate participants, that trauma propagated through systems in ways that either reinforced existing cruelties or catalyzed transformation towards something different. Thomas's choice in this moment would shape not just his own fate and Silas's death, but potentially influence how Daniel Blackwood approached the power he'd inherit when his uncle's estate eventually passed to the next generation. "Thomas, you out here tracking?" One of the house servants called, her voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that enslaved workers perfected when navigating between white family members and each other. "Young Master Daniel's looking for his brother. You seen Master Silas on your rounds?" The question demanded response that would either confirm or deny Silas's presence, would either draw the search party toward this location or redirect them elsewhere. Thomas had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether justice proceeded as planned or whether mercy toward someone who'd shown no mercy would reshape the afternoon's trajectory. He looked at Silas, seeing in the overseer's eyes the same desperate plea that Thomas had witnessed in countless other faces over 37 years. Grace begging not to be sold. Isaiah pleading for his father to do something, anything, to prevent his shipment to Louisiana. Workers asking for mercy before the whip fell, or before being forced to spend nights waist-deep in black water, while predators circled and mosquitoes feasted. Silas had ignored every plea, had proceeded with sales and punishments with mechanical efficiency that suggested those appeals registered no more significantly than bird songs or insect chorus. He'd been deaf to suffering when he held power, responsive only to his own interests and the profit calculations that governed estate operations. Now he begged for consideration he'd never extended to others, asked for mercy toward his brother that he'd never shown toward other people's family members. The bull alligator shifted position slightly, its massive tail creating ripples that spread across the water's surface like consequences radiating outward from central decisions. The creature's hunger remained unchanged, indifferent to human moral calculations about innocence and guilt, concerned only with the mathematical certainty that opportunity existed for feeding if interference could be avoided. Thomas removed his hand from Silas's mouth slowly, watching the overseer's face with the intensity of someone studying a specimen that might reveal fundamental truths about human nature under pressure. Would Silas scream for help immediately, prioritizing his own survival over his brother's psychological well-being? Or would he remain silent, accepting death to spare Daniel the trauma of witnessing fratricide administered through alligator teeth? The choice would reveal whether any capacity for selflessness existed beneath the layers of cruelty and self-interest that had defined Silas's tenure as overseer. It would demonstrate whether facing death could transform someone who'd spent years inflicting it on others through slower methods that slavery made legal and respectable. Silas's mouth worked silently for a moment, struggling between the survival instinct that demanded screaming for salvation and something else, some recognition that certain burdens shouldn't be placed on shoulders too young to carry their weight without permanent damage. The afternoon light slanted through cypress branches, painting his face an alternating shadow and golden illumination that made him look simultaneously ancient and childlike. A man confronting mortality's absolute certainty while grasping at the last opportunity to demonstrate something approaching human decency. "Don't tell him," Silas whispered finally, his voice barely audible above the swamp's constant background noise of insects and tree frogs and water moving through channels that had existed since before European ships arrived carrying human cargo across the Middle Passage. "Send them away. Let Daniel remember me as his brother rather than as food for swamp creatures." The request carried such unexpected recognition of others' well-being that Thomas felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, but perhaps acknowledgement that even people who'd inflicted tremendous suffering retained some capacity for choices that placed others' interests above their own. It didn't erase the sails and whippings and nights in the punishment swamp. It didn't balance scales that had tipped toward injustice for decades. But it suggested that human beings remained more complex than simple categories of good and evil could accommodate. Thomas stood slowly, his decision made through calculations that weighed justice against innocence, and found both wanting, found both necessary, found no synthesis that satisfied every moral demand simultaneously. He moved toward the voices calling his name, leaving Silas secured to the cypress trunk, while the bull alligator maintained its patient vigil in water that would soon run red with consequences that systems built on human bondage had cultivated through generations of systematic cruelty. Some choices required becoming what you'd been accused of being all along. Some justice demanded sacrifice of the very innocence it claimed to protect. And some afternoons transformed everyone they touched, leaving no participants unchanged regardless of which roles they'd played in dramas that unfolded in green cathedrals, where Spanish moss filtered judgment through branches older than the nation that had codified slavery into constitutional law. Thomas emerged from the cypress shadows to find Daniel Blackwood standing at the swamp's edge, his youthful face creased with worry that spoke to genuine fraternal affection. Two house servants flanked him, their expressions carefully neutral in the way that enslaved workers perfected when navigating the dangerous currents of white family dynamics. The younger Blackwood wore riding clothes still crisp, despite the humidity, his boots polished to a shine that reflected his privileged position in a hierarchy built on human suffering. "Thomas," Daniel called out with relief evident in his voice. "Have you seen my brother? He was supposed to check the punishment area this morning but never returned for the midday meal." The question hung in the thick air, while Thomas's mind raced through calculations that would determine multiple fates with a single response. Behind him, perhaps 150 yards deeper into the swamp, Silas remained secured to the cypress trunk, with the bull alligator circling closer. Ahead stood a 17-year-old whose innocence, such as it was, could still be preserved if Thomas chose words carefully enough to redirect the search party away from witnessing violence that would mark them all permanently. "Yes, sir, young Master Daniel," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the practiced deference that had kept him alive through decades of navigating power imbalances. "Saw Master Silas heading toward the eastern channels about 2 hours back. Said something about checking on reports of runaways moving through that section." The lie flowed smoothly, supported by Thomas's reputation as the estate's most reliable tracker. Daniel had no reason to question information from someone whose expertise in the swamp exceeded any white man's knowledge. The servants beside him relaxed slightly, grateful that their search could proceed along paths less treacherous than the deep channels where Thomas had just been standing. "The eastern section?" Daniel frowned, uncertainty crossing his features. "That's unusual. Silas typically follows his established routes with precision." Thomas nodded slowly, allowing concern to creep into his expression. "That's what struck me as odd too, sir, but he seemed determined about something. You know how your brother gets when he's tracking down infractions that need correcting." The statement carried double meaning that only Thomas fully appreciated, referencing Silas's obsessive need for control while simultaneously explaining why he might deviate from normal patterns. Daniel accepted the explanation with the trusting nature of someone who'd never developed the suspicious mindset that prolonged survival in systems built on deceit required. "We should follow that direction then," Daniel decided, turning to the servants. "Thomas, you'd better come with us in case we need someone who knows the terrain." The request created complications that threatened to unravel Thomas's carefully constructed misdirection. Accompanying the search party would prevent him from returning to complete what he'd started, would leave Silas secured in position where discovery by other searchers became increasingly likely as afternoon stretched toward evening. But refusing would raise questions about why the estate's best tracker wouldn't assist in locating a missing overseer. "With respect, young Master Daniel," Thomas said carefully, "I should probably check the western channels as well, just to be thorough. We can cover more ground if we split up. I'll meet you back at the main house before sunset with whatever I find." Daniel considered this proposal with the seriousness of someone new to authority and eager to demonstrate competence in crisis situations. The logic appeared sound, dividing resources to maximize search efficiency. And Thomas's suggestion to reconvene before sunset provided a reasonable time frame that suggested urgency without panic. "Very well," Daniel agreed after a moment's deliberation. "But if you find any sign of him, fire 3 shots from your rifle to signal the rest of us. And Thomas, be careful. My brother may be harsh in his methods, but he's still family. I'd take it poorly if anything happened to him while under our watch." The statement revealed Daniel's complicated position, acknowledging Silas's cruelty while maintaining familial loyalty that transcended moral judgments about methods employed. It suggested that the younger Blackwood possessed some awareness of his brother's brutality, but lacked either the power or inclination to challenge practices that maintained the system from which his family profited. Thomas watched them move eastward along the elevated path, their figures gradually disappearing into the vegetation that grew thick along the swamp's perimeter. The servants walked with visible relief at avoiding deeper incursions into terrain that had claimed lives and inspired fear stories whispered in the quarters after dark. Daniel moved with the confidence of youth that hadn't yet learned to fear environments where privilege provided no protection against natural forces indifferent to social hierarchies. When their voices faded beyond hearing range, Thomas turned back toward the channels where Silas waited with death circling in water dark as old sins. The sun had continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that transformed the swamp into something beautiful and terrible simultaneously. Spanish moss glowed golden in the slanted light, while shadows pooled in low places where predators gathered strength for evening hunts. He found Silas exactly where he'd left him, the overseer's face bearing the strained expression of someone who'd spent the last minutes contemplating mortality with absolute clarity. The rope burns had deepened, weeping fluid that attracted insects in numbers that suggested feast days approaching. The bull alligator had moved closer during Thomas's absence, now positioned perhaps 10 feet from where Silas stood secured to the cypress trunk. "Did you send them away?" Silas asked, his voice hoarse from fear and the rope's constant pressure against his throat. Thomas nodded slowly, studying the man who'd inflicted so much suffering while convincing himself he was simply performing necessary duties. "Your brother will remember you as missing rather than as meat for swamp creatures. That's more consideration than you showed Grace when you sold her. More than you gave Isaiah when you shipped him to sugar fields that kill young men in seasons." He pulled the knife from his belt, the blade catching fading sunlight in ways that made it seem alive with captured fire. The choice had been made during those moments with Daniel, finalized through calculations that weighed innocence against justice and found both necessary, both insufficient, both demanding sacrifice that would mark everyone involved. "I'm going to cut you free now," Thomas said quietly. "What happens next depends on choices you've already made, debts you've already accumulated, and whether alligators are hungry enough to do what legal systems built on human bondage will never accomplish." The knife moved through rope with surgical precision, severing fibers that had held Silas in position for hours. The overseer stumbled forward as restraints released, his waterlogged boots losing purchase on submerged roots, slick with algae and decades of accumulated debris. His hands clawed at air, seeking balance that eluded him as momentum carried him toward deeper water where prehistoric appetite waited with patient certainty. The bull alligator struck with explosive violence that transformed stillness into chaos in less than a heartbeat. jaws closing around Silas's torso with force that crushed ribs and drove screams from lungs suddenly unable to draw breath. The death roll began immediately, the massive predator spinning its body with hydraulic power that pulled its prey beneath the surface in a maelstrom of churning water and thrashing limbs. Thomas watched from safe distance as justice executed itself through teeth older than human cruelty, as the swamp collected payment for services rendered during years of punishment administered in its depths. When the water finally stilled and silence returned to the green cathedral, he turned and walked away without looking back, carrying the weight of what he'd done toward an uncertain future where consequences would arrive in forms he couldn't predict or control. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.